story really goes back to before the war, when a man called Jennings, Joseph Jennings, was working on the origin of the Broads when he was a research student at Cambridge. He had to give up his work during the course of the war when he was called up. But after the war was over, he wanted to resume it. And at that time, I was becoming interested in the vegetation of the Broads. And I linked up with Jennings with the idea of linking the present surface vegetation with the deposits underneath. We worked together for some 3 years, and Jennings was putting down his bores at quite large intervals of distance, something like perhaps 100 yards apart. And I was trying to relate vegetation above these bores to the deposits beneath. However, I was finding that there were rather sharp boundaries in the vegetation. And these sharp boundaries in the vegetation, I wanted to relate to the underlying deposits, to any possible changes in the underlying deposits. And this meant that progressively I was needing to put down bores at closer and closer intervals until eventually I was putting them down at about 3 or 4 feet apart. And it's that then when the sharp edges of overgrown margins of the Broads were beginning to demonstrate themselves. I was finding these sharp edges not only in one Broad, but practically everywhere where I looked for them. And the islands in the Broads and the peninsulas were sticking into the Broads, sticking out into the Broads, were also evincing these sharp edges, which made me begin to think again whether man hadn't had a much bigger part in the formation of the Broads than he had done previously. I was doing this on my own from 1950 onwards, because Jennings by that time had decided that he had more or less solved the problem and was not interested in carrying on into the different valleys. However, the vegetation in the different valleys was very different. The vegetation in the various valleys was very different. So for vegetational reasons, I had to continue into the other valleys, and it was there that I was finding these sharp edges, which we had not noticed much previously. This again was by the same boring techniques, using bores that brought up peat samples from anything from anything from the surface to 30 or 40 feet down, able to bring these up. And the peats and muds were very different in texture at these places where the Broad ended, as it were. We had peat. Where the Broad began, we had the muds which had filled up the Broads. It was necessary to have a good deal of, shall we say, mechanical help with the actual boring. And here I was fortunate that some of the local schoolboys got interested in the project and very kindly came to give me a hand with the actual technique of boring, and also with the very, shall we say, very onerous task of taking down notes as one of the bores were proceeding, because it was very difficult to write in a notebook at the same time as boring with muddy, wet hands. Well, as soon as we found that these straight edges and flat bottoms were turning up so many places, and as soon as we got the idea that the Broads might be artificial, or at least partly artificial, instead of natural, then a whole lot of other odd phenomena immediately fell into place. For instance, these peninsulas, which were running out of the Broads, and it was particularly well demonstrated in Barton Broad, were found to be parallel. Also, we found that these peninsulas changed direction at Old Parish boundary, the Barton-Erstead boundary. They changed direction. We found at the bottom of the Broads there were little pockets of clay which were identical with the clay of the that had been laid down by the sea, and these were obviously bits of clay which the peat diggers had thrown down as being no use to the when they were digging out the peat. They'd thrown them down and they'd got to the bottom of the peat pits, and there had become incorporated. Once the idea had been mooted that the Broads were of probable artificial origin rather than the natural origin of which they had been which had been suggested before, it was of course necessary to back up the theory by historical evidence for large-scale peat cutting in the past. At this stage, we enlisted the help of Dr. Clifford Smith of Cambridge University, who was a historical geographer, and he took on the task of looking into what historical records there were, firstly to determine at what period of time this large peat cutting could be had been taking place, and secondly, whether peat cutting of the scale that was necessary could have been possible with the relatively primitive tools that one had at the time. By looking at past historical records, old estate maps, old documents, and so on, he was able to show, firstly, which was most important, that in one case at least, he could trace an actual transition from a turbary, which was the old word for a turf pit, from turbary to Broad in the actual records themselves. But he also found numerous records of the use of peat in roughly medieval times, beginning somewhere at the invasion of the Danes and ending somewhere at the late 14th or 15th or early 15th century. He was further able to show by calculations that to have extracted peat on the scale that was necessary was not impossible, considering that Norfolk at that time was one of the most densely populated areas in the British Isles, and there was a great demand for peat, which was turning up in various rolls and various old records of Norwich Priory and St. Bennett's and various places like that, so that the whole thing did not seem impossible. The story of, or shall we say, the hypothesis at that time of the artificial origin of the Broads rather than natural origin of the Broads was highly publicized in the local newspapers, and there was a lot of, shall we say, controversy about this. There was a lot of opposition to the theory. People couldn't believe that their beloved Broads really had such a mundane origin. But there was support from various people in Cambridge with whom I've been working, particularly Dr. Godwin, and eventually the Royal Geographical Society decided they would publish the whole story, and that came out as a Royal Geographical Society memoir in 1960.